I'm James Myers, host of Plato's Pod, and in this episode I'm continuing a discussion with Michael Fitzpatrick on the subject of Plato's seventh letter. Written by Plato, the seventh letter describes his extraordinary experience in Syracuse under the rule of the tyrant Dionysius II. The letter was addressed to the followers of Dion, who was a philosophically minded and trusted advisor of Dionysius' father, but under Dionysius' son suffered banishment, confiscation of property, and ultimately assassination. Plato's seventh letter is not just an artifact of ancient history. It offers a valuable and very relevant context for politics in the 21st century, and Michael and I continue to explore the modern connections of Plato's timeless perspectives. In our next episode, we'll continue to look at Plato's letters, the sixth and the eighth, for a further glimpse to the mind of the thinker whose words resonate with meaning now, 2,400 years after he wrote them. We'd love to hear your comments and suggestions for Plato's Pod. Please contact us at dialoguesonplato@outlook.com to share your thoughts. And now, with thanks for sharing your time with us, here's the second half of our discussion on Plato's seventh letter. It's great to be back with you, Michael, to continue our discussion on Plato's seventh letter, in which he relates his experience in Syracuse with the tyrant Dionysius and the philosophically inclined Dion.
I'm excited to be here, James, and I think listeners are going to find that there is some real philosophical wisdom in the sections we're going to read today.
Indeed, yes, and the section we'll start with it gets pretty deep in terms of Plato's thinking about the forms and all sorts of connections again to the Republic that we talked about last time. So last time we discussed the first of two themes in the seventh letter, the ills that befall the city whose rulers don't practice philosophy. And today we'll look at the second, the question, can virtue be taught? And so at the outset of our last discussion, I compared Plato to the prisoner in the cave from the Republic. The prisoner was the one who was shackled and could only look at images projected onto the cave wall and thinking that they were reality, when in fact they're just projected by men moving their hands in front of torches. And this comes through, I think, really clearly in terms of what Plato is saying in the section from 341c to 343d, which I thought I would start by reading. It's a longer section, and then it's followed by another few smaller sections, which maybe I'll read at the same time, then we can discuss them. So this is the part where Plato famously said that he never put his opinions in writing. So I'll just start by reading this, starting at 341c. So much at least I can afford with confidence about any who have written or proposed to write on these questions, pretending to a knowledge of the problems with which I am concerned, whether they claim to have learned from me or from others, or to have made their discoveries for themselves. It is impossible, in my opinion, that they can have learned anything at all about the subject. There is no writing of mine about these matters, nor will there ever be one. For this knowledge is not something that can be put into words like other sciences. But after long continued intercourse between teacher and pupil, in joint pursuit of the subject, suddenly, like light flashing forth when a fire is kindled, it is born in the soul and straightway nourishes itself. And this too I know, if these matters are to be expounded at all in books or lectures, they would best come from me. Certainly I am harmed not least of all if they are misrepresented. If I thought that they could be put into written words adequate for the multitude, what nobler work could I do in my life than to compose something of such great benefit to mankind and bring to light the nature of all of things for all to see? But I don't think that the examination, as it is called, of these questions would be of any benefit to men, except to a few, i.e. those who could with a little guidance discover the truth by themselves. Of the rest, some would be filled with an ill-founded and quite unbecoming disdain, and some with an exaggerated and foolish elation, as if they had learned something grand. Let me go into these matters at somewhat greater length, for perhaps what I am saying will become clearer when I've done so. There is a true doctrine that confutes anyone who has presumed to write anything whatever on such subjects, a doctrine that I have often before expounded, but it seems that it must now be said again. For every real being, there are three things that are necessary, if knowledge of it is to be acquired. First, the name. Second, the definition. Third, the image. Knowledge comes forth. And in the fifth place, we must place the object itself, the knowable and truly real being. To understand what this means, take a particular example and think of all the other subjects as analogous to it. There is something called a circle, and its name is this very word we have just used. Second, there is its definition, composed of nouns and verbs. Quote, the figure whose extremities are everywhere equally distant from its center, unquote, is the definition of precisely that to which the names round, circumference, and circle apply. Third is what we draw or rub out, what is turned or destroyed, but the circle itself to which they all refer remains unaffected, because it is different from them. In the fourth place are knowledge, episteme, reasons, nous, and right opinion, which are in our minds not the words of bodily shapes, and therefore must be taken together as something distinct both from the circle itself and from the three things previously mentioned. Of these, reason is nearest the fifth in its kinship and likeness, while the others are further away. The same thing is true of straight-lined as well as of circular figures, of color, of the good, the beautiful, the just, of body in general, whether artificial or natural, or fire, water, and all the elements, of all living beings and qualities of souls, of all actions and affectations. For in each case, whoever does not somehow grasp the four things mentioned will never fully attain knowledge of the fifth. These things, moreover, because of the weakness of language, are just as concerned with making clear the particular property of each object as the being of it. On this account, no sensible man will venture to express his deepest thoughts in words, especially in a form which is unchangeable, as is true of written outlines. Let us go back and study again the illustration just given. Every circle that we make or draw in common life is full of characteristics that contradict the fifth, for it everywhere touches a straight line, while the circle itself, we say, has in it not the slightest element belonging to a contrary nature. And we say that their names are by no means fixed. There is no reason why what we call circles might not be called straight lines, and the straight line circles, and their natures will be none the less fixed despite this exchange of names. Indeed, the same thing is true of the definition. Since it is a combination of nouns and verbs, there is nothing surely fixed about it. Much more might be said to show that each of these four instruments is unclear, but the most important point is what I said earlier, that of the two objects of search, the particular quality and the being of an object, the soul seeks to know not the quality but the essence, whereas each of these four instruments presents to the soul, in discourse and in examples, what she is not seeking, and thus makes it easy to refute by sense perception anything that may be said or pointed out, and fills everyone, so to speak, with perplexity and confusion. Now, in those matters in which, because of our defective training, we are not accustomed to look for truth, but are satisfied with the first image suggested to us, we can ask and answer without making ourselves ridiculous to one another, being proficient in manipulating and testing these four instruments. But when it is the fifth, about which we are compelled to answer questions or to make explanations, then anyone who wishes to refute has the advantage, and can make the propounder of a doctrine, whether in writing or speaking or in answering questions, seem to most of his listeners completely ignorant of the matter on which he is trying to speak or write. Those who are listening sometimes do not realize that it is not the mind of the speaker or writer who is being refuted, but these four instruments mentioned, each of which is by nature defective. So just pause there briefly. There's so much that he refers to in this, but I just wanted to recall for listeners the distinction between the realm of being and becoming that Plato often makes in his dialogues. And here he's talking about the realm of becoming, which is that ever-changing realm of images, things that are never permanent. And then he contrasts that to the realm of being, which is that permanent, unchanging nature of things. And he uses the circle as an example of some idea that is not existing in real, like in the realm of becoming, but it exists as an idea in the realm of being. So I just thought I'd mention that briefly, and then I'll go on to read. This continues on starting at 343e to 344d. By the repeated use of all these instruments, ascending and descending to each in turn, it is barely possible for knowledge to be engendered of an object naturally good, in a man naturally good, but if his nature is defective, as is that of most men, for the acquisition of knowledge in the so-called virtues, and if the qualities he has have been corrupted, then not even Lysias would make such a man see. In short, neither quickness nor learning nor a good memory can make a man see when his nature is not akin to the object, for this knowledge never takes root in an alien nature, so that no man who is naturally inclined and akin to justice and all other forms of excellence, even though he may be quick in learning and remembering this and that and other things, nor any man who, though akin to justice, is slow at learning and forgetful, will ever attain the truth that is attainable about virtue. Nor about vice either, for these must be learned together. just as the truth and error about any part of being must be learned together through long and earnest labor, as I said at the beginning. Only when all of these things, names, definitions, and visual and other perceptions, have been rubbed against one another and tested, pupil and teacher asking and answering questions in goodwill and without envy, only then, when reason and knowledge are at the very extremity of human effort, can they illuminate the nature of any object. For this reason, anyone who is seriously studying high matters will be the last to write about them and thus expose his thoughts to the envy and criticism of men. What I have said comes, in short, to this. Whenever we see a book, whether the laws of a legislator or a composition on any other subject, we can be sure that if the author is really serious, this book does not contain his best thoughts. They are stored away with the fairest of his possessions. And if he has committed these serious thoughts to writing, it is because men, not the gods, have taken his wits away. So that's that long part about which Plato talks on his opinions about, or that he never presents his opinions in writing. I'll just read one little bit here from 343b to c. The topic of the soul seeks the universal being of a thing, not its becoming. He writes, much more might be said to show that each of these four instruments is unclear, but the most important point is what I said earlier, that of the two objects of search, the particular quality and the being of an object, the soul seeks to know not the quality but the essence, whereas each of these four instruments present to the soul, in discourse and in examples, what she is not seeking, and thus makes it easy to refute by sense perception anything that may be said or pointed out, and fills everyone, so to speak, with perplexity and confusion. Well, I'll stop reading there, and there's a lot to discuss in there. We talked last time about how the voice of Plato seems to come through in this letter, and how some of the letters are thought to be maybe not from Plato, but maybe from his admirers or people copying his style. But this section just really struck me as one where the voice of Plato comes through clearly, and that he's talking about the realm of being and becoming, the idea of the forms when he talks about the circle. And there's reminiscent when he talks about the circle, my favorite line in Plato, Parmenides 137e, where he compares the properties of straight and round. And he does this again in this letter. So he's echoing things that he's said many times elsewhere, but I think quite eloquently. And again, putting it in the context of what's happening in Syracuse. And I should have said at the beginning that this is what he's saying after it was reported that Dionysius had distributed a book of Plato's thoughts, which Plato says didn't exist. So, Michael, your thoughts on this?
Well, there's two things that stand out to me initially. The first is there's a number of places in the readings that you just shared where Plato is quite funny. That he's clever, he's jocular, he's being a little satirical. I particularly like that line on that second chunk of reading at the end where he says that if somebody does commit their serious thoughts to writing, it is because men, not the gods, have taken their wits away.
Yeah, that's a good one. Yeah.
Um, so I hope people hear some of the joy that is always behind Plato's writings, whatever he's doing. And then the second observation, I think, to your initial theme here is why does Plato say he hasn't written down his thoughts if we all know that we have these wonderful dialogues of Plato that seem to write down his thoughts? And I think the key to this is contained in that line at the very beginning of the readings where it says, this knowledge is not something that can be put into words like other sciences, but after long continued intercourse between teacher and pupil in joint pursuit of the subject, suddenly, like light flashing forth when a fire is kindled, it is born in the soul and straightway nourishes itself. And it's interesting that outside of the epistles and a few public lectures that Plato gave, which we don't have preserved copies of the text, we don't ever find Plato giving a didactic presentation of teachings. He's always representing a dialogue. And so it would be a mistake to read this and think Plato has no thoughts. No, Plato has many thoughts and ideas and doctrines, and they are in the dialogues, but they're not there in a kind of schematic form, say the kind that his student Aristotle would go on to present, because Plato thinks it does you no good for him to just quote unquote give you the answer key. That the only way your soul will benefit is if these thoughts are born afresh in your soul and you see the truth for yourself. So he is not saying here, contrary to some scholarly temptations, he is not saying he never wrote anything down. He's saying that he never wrote a didactic treatise that he published. Now, I just alluded that he did give some public lectures, and I think the fact that we don't have any historical copies of those lectures is testament that he made sure to hide them or destroy them or whatever he did not distribute them for posterity. And I think it's because in his mind, a public lecture is still an opportunity for dialogue. Nothing's been written down, it's out in the air. I'm just speaking it. Whereas if he had published the written lectures, that would be different. And so I think what we have in his canon is consistent with what he says here.
I agree, and I think the importance of dialogue is again highlighted by that little quote that I read at the end of our last discussion. The fact that one needs friends to engage in dialogue with. And Dionysius, as he kept saying through the letter, doesn't have friends. And so that there was that quote that I read at 332c. But Dionysius, though he had united all Sicily into a single city, for he knew that he could trust no one, was scarcely able to survive, for he was poor in friends and loyal followers, and the possession and lack of these is the best indication of a man's virtue or vice. There's a second quote that's just short one too. It's another sentence, 332d. We said that once embarked upon the course just mentioned, he, meaning Dionysius, should induce others among his relatives and companions to become friends and partners in the pursuit of virtue, but above all, to become a friend to himself, for in this respect he was incredibly deficient. And yeah, as you were talking about the need for discussion, I think it's important for this friendship to develop, for the ability to talk to other people. And although Plato went there at Dionysius' request twice, he really didn't get that discussion with Dionysius. It didn't seem like Dionysius, as you said, was kind of looking for the answer key, and Plato wasn't able to give it. Now, one of the things that I think is very contentious about Plato is the thought that he keeps referring to an eternal truth, something that we can't see. And I think science now tends to look for empirical evidence. And when empirical evidence can't be found, a thing is thought not to exist. Whereas I think here Plato is saying that there are things like circles, which we all know we can never create a perfect circle in our physical existence. Um, but the perfect circle exists in the idea of the circle. And I think here he's saying that we need to reach out to those eternal ideas. And that's in the realm of being, which is you cannot see it. You cannot see the realm of being. It's the eternal realm, but it's the idea of the circle on which we base all of the circular things that we make in the ever-changing realm of becoming, this continuing motion of the physical world. So I think that's a really contentious thing about Plato, but it's something that he says again clearly here. You know, when he refers to truth, the true, the good, and the beautiful, and then he talks at the beginning of the part that I read about the light. Several times he talks about the light. And I think there was a line, I'm trying to remember the line from the Republic. The light is that which allows us to see. It's not seen itself, it's what allows us to see. So again, you know, kind of this reference to the light and images and not staring at things and thinking that they are all that exists, I think is the key thing, one of the key things that I get out of this. And I think by implication, I don't know what you think about this, by implication is he saying that Dionysius is maybe like the prisoner in the cave, seeing these images and thinking that they're reality, but not really reaching out to that eternal realm, which you have to find on your own. He's saying nobody, he can't put it in writing. You have to find it on your own.
Yeah, we could almost say that um, you can point somebody where to look, but you can't see for them. They have to exercise their own acuity. And for Plato, we have our five senses, which perceive the world, but we also have nous, which perceives the being of the world. Um, this passage that we're reading here is very close to, and certainly is the inspiration for Descartes' Meditations. And although Descartes has a slightly different agenda, he uses an example there that I actually think is really fitting here. He talks about a piece of wax that he has. He's sitting by the fireplace. He has this piece of wax, and he talks about, the different perceptual qualities that the wax has. And then he says, but what if I put it by the fire and it melts and it loses its shape and its texture and it smells and stuff? Is it still the same piece of wax? And he says, well, it is, but that's not something I can grasp with my perceptual faculties, because my perceptual faculties are saying all the qualities have changed. So by that reasoning, it's a different object. Only my mind can grasp the intelligible continuity of this object as it has changed its perceptual qualities. And that's a similar type of move that I think Plato is doing here. I really love this progression that he gives us, moving from the name to the definition to the image to the fourth area. I think is one that might confuse listeners. So I'm going to suggest that people should think of this as concepts. So concepts are different than forms for Plato. So concepts are something that's in your head. It's something that you develop with your mind to try to get a grip on the world. Whereas a form is something that's objective and a part of being. So he's saying we move from naming something to defining something, which it's very important to understand. For him, that's a linguistic act. He's always talking about nouns and verbs. It's not something that's totally gelled in our minds yet. Third is the image, and I love the example here. He says, third is what we draw or rub out, what is turned or destroyed. So in the example of geometry, he's thinking of the Euclidean geometer who's drawing diagrams of shapes and then making measurements or marking down the lengths of different sides or the circumference or whatever. And that's still not something permanent because you can take your eraser and you can erase it, right? And it's only when we get to that fourth thing, the concept, that we start to get to something more permanent. We're using our reason, but it's still not to the eternal being because we can still change our minds. We can still revise our concepts. And it's only when we get to that fifth thing where we've touched something that is where our thinking and the being of things have become indiscernible, where we've sort of melded with the reality of something. We've had that epiphany.
That's a really great way of putting it, melded with reality. It reminds me actually, when in the Meno, which this the central question of Plato's dialogue, the Meno was, is virtue, can virtue be taught, which is what we're talking about now. Um, and I recall from the Meno, he made the statement that knowledge is the account of the reasons why. So one has to be able to reason, which is what he's saying is part of that fifth element that he's talking about. So he starts with name, definition, image, knowledge, and then kind of that eternal thing that we can reference by reason. It's not visible, it's referable by reason, not by the eyes or any of the other four senses. I think that's the key. And what you said about Descartes' meditations, I recall that actually. the wax analogy, and that was really effective. And again, it talks to that last part that I read when Plato said that the soul seeks to know not the quality, but the essence. Um, the quality is something that can change. You know, if we have the idea of chair, people can make many different types of chairs and many different styles. They're still all chairs. They all adhere to the essence of chair, but the qualities are different. And I think this is maybe, this is maybe something, an issue with technology that we have now, that we think that the permanence of something is computable, where it's maybe not computable. I think that's what he's saying here. If it were computable, one could put it in writing. One could write an algorithm for these things. But I think he's saying here that it's not computable. It's something that's only reached by the mind, which is contentious, I think, for a lot of people. I mean, what would the what would how would science change, I guess, if Plato were here and the scientist says, well, if you can't produce empirical evidence of something, it doesn't exist. How would Plato counter that? What would he say in response?
Well, one of the things that I think he's really stressing here is while those first four elements are important, he says here very clearly, whoever does not grasp the first four things will never fully attain knowledge of the fifth. So he's not anti-world, he's not anti-empirical, he's not rejecting the senses. But I think he would say if you only have those first four, then you're never going to attain true knowledge because the world of sense perception is always shifting. And so, what Plato actually thinks is the scientist, when they develop a body of knowledge, is attaining that fifth realm without acknowledging it. They don't recognize that they've actually made the move to discover a form. Now, actually, some scientists do recognize that, especially physicists working in the beginning part of the 20th century. If you think of scholars like Heisenberg or Albert Einstein, they were really in tune with the connection between metaphysics and the sciences. And so when Einstein proposed his formula, E equals mc squared, he talked about that as discerning an essence. He did not think that what he had produced was an empirical product. It was something that could only be seen intelligibly by carefully studying the empirical phenomena. And that is exactly what Plato is saying here. So Plato's not going to refute the scientist by saying what you know is not real knowledge. He's going to say the only way you have the knowledge you have is because you have exercised your nous, your reason, to discern the essences of things in the midst of the changing phenomenon.
Yeah, I like the way you put that, that one doesn't refute the physical evidence, but one needs to go a step further and ask for the account of the reasons why. And this is, I guess, when maybe science a lot of times now is focused on the how. I mean, we're very keen on developing technology, and one has to answer the question, how does one do this? And we're getting great. We're producing some amazing technological inventions by answering the question how. But we do need to, I guess, step back and look at the question why. And that's something that, maybe where philosophy needs to reach some understanding with science, and maybe a little bit of the same language. I think some scientists might dismiss philosophy, others accept it. But maybe there's some common language that needs to be developed, that philosophy is not just talking about abstract ideas, it's actually talking about how one applies the abstract to what we see in this ever changing realm of becoming.
Yeah, we get a couple really important insights in this section about why philosophy fails to gain traction in the wider discourse. One is towards the end of that first big section we read, where he talks about people who try to refute knowledge of the essences of the forms by giving refutations to those first four forms of inquiry, the name, the definition, and so on. So there's a kind of misalignment there that, he says very clearly that no empirical circle is going to be as circular as the idea of the circle, right? And he says, so the mistake that people make is pointing to the imperfections of the empirical circle as reasons to believe that there is no form of the circle. And that's a misplaced criticism that the form, the perfection of the form is not slighted by the imperfections of the phenomena because the phenomena always participate in the forms. They're not identical to the forms. So that's one source for where philosophy and the sciences could be at cross purposes. They're not talking about the same things. So that might be between scholars, people working at the technical level. But I think your question, your comments, James, also speak to how philosophy is perceived and used in the popular realm. And back towards the beginning of that section, at the end of that first full paragraph, he talks about people who are given an answer key, a didactic presentation of philosophical ideas. And he says these would be of little benefit to people because for most people, and now I'll read the quote here, they would be filled with an ill-founded and quite unbecoming disdain, and some with an exaggerated and foolish elation as if they had learned something grand. So this is something that I see even to this day. So some people are going to read philosophical ideas and they're going to say, oh, that's ridiculous because it is at odds with their quote unquote common sense. You brought up the cave analogy. So if you're in the cave and you're staring at shadows on the wall, that's what you know. And the philosopher is going to come along and talk about the world in a way that's really discordant from those shadows. So that's the people who are going to be like, oh, that's silly. I remember years ago listening to somebody talk about this was an older person talking about when they were a young student sitting in a philosophy class, and they said, oh, the first day the professor walked in and said something like, you don't even know if the chair you're sitting on is really there. And they scoffed and said, that was the moment I knew that class wasn't for me, and I walked out. And so that's the disdain that Plato's talking about. But then there are other people, they pick up a philosophy book from the bookstore, they read a passage, it's really pithy and eye-popping, and they go, oh, wow, I learned something grand. I have this new nugget, but they haven't done the dialectical work to really birth the perception of the form in themselves. So they think they've learned and they think they're doing philosophy or praising philosophy, but they're taking a shortcut. They're not actually going through that process. So those are some of the ways in this section that I see Plato identifying the breakdown between philosophy and either the sciences or the wider culture.
Mhm. And, when people engage in dialogue, I guess in the dialogue, we sometimes hear, and if it's an open dialogue, not a, unfortunately, technology is also driving us to these kind of echo chambers where we join communities where they only think the same way that we do. And it just reinforces existing ideas. But if we have an open conversation, I think in that conversation, we discover in the ideas of other people things that we didn't know. And I think that's the key, and that's why the oracle at Delphi said that Socrates was the wisest person alive, for he knew one thing, which is he didn't know anything. And so one can go around saying that one knows these things, but does one truly know things? Can one trace that knowledge back to the very origin, to the form of the thing? I think is what Plato is saying here. If one were to write it down as if it were knowledge, the reader would take it maybe just as knowledge and not proceed any further. Whereas if there was a discussion, we could see, well, there's different interpretations. And I think that's why, the really interesting thing about his reference to words, starting with the name and the definition, and then fitting that to the image in the third part, the name and the definition are very important. And as we talked about last time, we can use words, names like democracy, and people will assume what it is. But if we actually had a discussion, we would find that there is a huge amount of disagreement of what democracy actually is. And I think that's the key. And I'm not sure that we're necessarily engaging in that kind of language in the way that he's foreseeing. In my thinking, language is the thing that really makes humans stand out as creatures. We have that ability to abstract. Without language, we couldn't abstract things. So I think that's really important. And can language be developed? Can language be understood without that back and forth conversation? Maybe that's another key thing that ties into that need not to just put things down in writing as if that's all there is to know.
Yeah. Didn't he say somewhere here that language will never be sufficient? We covered a lot of ground here. I
Yeah.
can't remember if it was in this passage or not, but it seems like he talks about, well, I mean, he talks about the unfixedness of language. I love this line where he says, we could call circles straight lines, we could call straight lines circles. I mean, names are arbitrary, but at the same time, they're not, because as you just pointed out, if democracy just names lots of different things, then there's no way to have a constructive conversation about what democracy is, much less what it should be. So the value of names is that it allows us to carve up the world and investigate it. The value of definitions is that it allows us to test hypotheses. That's what Plato is doing in the dialogues. He has the interlocutors propose a definition. Euthyphro says, here's what piety is. And then they test it and find out that's not what piety is. But the only way to do that is to have a definition. And same with the images. I think he thinks of the images for the geometer as a laboratory. This is a testing ground to try out different theorems and proposals. But ultimately, we need to get to constructing concepts and then trying to see if those concepts correspond to forms before we're actually going to know something. And so it sounds like you're saying when it comes to something like the political realm, if we're never trying to get to a form of justice, then when we argue over definitions of democracy, we're just going to be arguing over our diverse preferences about what democracy could be. And there's no truth to that. That would be like you and me arguing over flavors of ice cream. You say mint chip is the best flavor of ice cream, and I say caramel butter toffee is the best flavor of ice cream. I mean, that says something about our preferences, but it doesn't say anything about the truth or what kind of accord we should draw because there's nothing corresponding to it. And I just want to note before we go any further here that there is this line in that first big paragraph where Plato makes it clear that this whole model is not just something that applies to speculative proclivities of philosophers, it applies to everything. He says the same thing is true of straight line as well as circular figures, of color, of the good, the beautiful, the just, of body in general, whether artificial or natural, to the elements, to all living beings and qualities of souls, and to all actions and affections. So, anybody who thinks what we're talking about is abstract stuff that has nothing to do with real life, no, this is about getting to the essence of all the things that make up lived experience.
Hmm. Yeah, a really good way of putting it. It makes me think actually when I spent a week in August attending a math conference of all things. I'm not a mathematician, but near the end of it, one of the presenters asked the question, who among us are Platonists? And about 90% of the hands shot up. I think it's commonly said that 90% of mathematicians are Platonists. And then the question arose, well, what does being a Platonist mean in the context of math? And so there was some discussion that ensued whether math is discovered or invented. There was a few people who adamantly held that math is invented by the mind rather than discovered. But again, it gets to this question of, is there an eternal truth? And the definition of things is very important. For example, it makes we use the word good, and everybody, of course, has a different concept of what good is, and good applies to many different circumstances and situations. So, what's good in one situation would be different in another context. But he does provide a definition of the form of the good. And I think this is in the Republic. He says, the form of the good is that which gives truth to the things known and the power to know to the knower. Again, it's kind of talking about this eternal truth that can only be reached through the mind. It can't be reached by the five senses. The five senses can give us some direction, maybe, can give us things to gauge truths by, but one can't just stop there. And I think in the part that starts at 343E, where he says, in short, neither quickness nor learning nor a good memory can make a man see when his nature is not akin to the object, for this knowledge never takes root in an alien nature, so that no man who is not naturally inclined and akin to justice and all other forms of excellence, even though he may be quick at learning and remembering this and that and other things, nor any man who, though akin to justice, is slow at learning and forgetful, will never attain the truth that is attainable about virtue. I like the way that he says that your nature has to be akin to it. You can't be truth itself, but you can approach truth. And those who want to, those who are open minded enough, like Dion, I guess, in the case of Syracuse, will have more success at virtue than Dionysius. And so I guess the question, can virtue be taught? The answer would seem to be no, although he did lead Dionysius or Dion to find out more about virtue. And he attempted to lead Dionysius, but Dionysius wouldn't go.
Yeah, the question, can virtue be taught, is, of course, a much discussed and debated question in Plato's larger work. And I think my reading, this might be slightly different than yours. My reading is that it's an ambiguous question. I can't be virtuous for you, and I can't make you be virtuous. So, in that sense, virtue cannot be taught. It can only be developed, cultivated within oneself. But on the other hand, we know that Plato puts an enormous stress on the value of education. And I think it's because he thinks that people who are presented with the right forms of literature and with the kind of discipline that physical exercise and gymnastics provides, and who learn how to formulate mathematical proofs and to understand what makes for a good tragedy and whatnot, that all of these are going to build the kinds of habits and the kinds of nous in your soul that's going to lead to virtue. So it's kind of ambiguous. So I don't take him here in this passage to be saying that having a naturally inclined soul to justice and other forms of excellence, that that's a matter of birth. I don't think he's saying some people are born good, some people are born bad, and it's just luck of the draw. What I think he's saying is, if you want to be virtuous, you have to cultivate a nature that inclines towards virtue. So nature here is not something that is fixed or immutable. It's something that we can make better or worse depending on our education and on the discipline that we undergo in ourselves. And so that for me leads to the passage right after the part you read. And he says, nor about vice either, for these, virtue and vice, must be learned together, just as the truth and error about any part of being must be learned together. So he is talking about learning something there. But now he gives the conditions of this learning process, and I just love these lines. He says, through long and earnest labor, this comes about. So he thinks that it's very difficult to become somebody who masters the excellencies of virtue, who resists the temptations of vice, who learns to perceive the truth and eschew falsehood. And then he goes on to talk about the method of this. Only when all these things, names, definitions, visual, and other perceptions, have been rubbed against one another and tested, pupil and teacher asking and answering questions in goodwill and without envy. Only then, when reason and knowledge are at the very extremity of human effort, can they illuminate the nature of any object. Now, my hope would be that scientists listening to our conversation would actually recognize some of their own work in this statement, that true scientific discovery is the result of many expensive grants and years of failed experiments and stumbling in the dark and public sometimes acrimonious debates between great luminaries and so on. And he's saying that this is the form of all knowledge, that it's not just that you get the definitions and the visual thing and the names and the concepts. It's that you have to go through this process of rubbing them against each other, testing them. And then you do that through dialectic, pupil and teacher answering and asking questions. And the last thing I want to say here is you brought up social media and technology as they've influenced our conversations today. And I think the biggest impact that they have had is they have taken out the conditions for this testing. He says here, pupil and teacher asking and answering questions in goodwill and without envy. Now, goodwill means I don't have an agenda. I'm not trying to get leverage over you. I'm not trying to win an argument. I'm not trying to buck up my tribe or get more votes for my team or something like that. I have no ulterior motive. And then without envy means that I'm not looking at you as somebody who is superior to me, that I need to prove that I'm on the level with you, that I'm your peer, and therefore I have to refute you or shame you or publicly humiliate you in some way. There's no envy between us. And so he's talking about a true, deep philosophical equality as the condition for the dialectic that is necessary to learn these things.
I love the way you said that social media removes the conditions for that testing. I think that's great. That we need to acknowledge that we need to acknowledge that we need to test our ideas. And I think that's why Socrates, I think it's just near the end of the Meno, he says, never stop seeking to learn. I mean, we just have to continue learning and exercising that ability of the mind to imagine new things. I think that's the key. Maybe we stop doing that when we rely on technology sometimes. And we're now facing these big debates about generative AI. Why would we need to learn how to write when we could ask the machine to write for us? But the good writing comes about from experiments, from mistake, trial and error, from other people's opinions, and all of that makes for good writing. But if it's just a kind of endless feedback loop from a machine, then will the names and the definitions start to get mixed up? I mean, I think we're seeing some evidence of that happening now. And I know there's scientists talking about how with the machine learning part of generative AI, that it's almost running out of content to train on, and the machines are starting to train on their own outputs. So we really do run into the risk of a feedback loop there. So as you said, long and earnest labor, definitely. And I wanted to highlight too something in the scientific method that we can't forget. And as you said, scientists use different methods to arrive at their ideas, and one of them is thought experiments. I understand that Einstein, one of the major impetuses to his discovery of E equals mc squared is as a teenager, he imagined what it would be like to ride on a light wave. So one can't surf on a light wave, but he pictured it. And this makes me maybe a point that I was thinking about yesterday is that are ideas built up from nothing to something, or do we, when we form ideas, do we take all of the existence of the things that we see and kind of disassemble them and put them together into different arrangements and coming up with these things. So in Einstein's thought experiment, he took what he knew about light and then he imagined it in a different context of what it would be like to actually ride on that light wave. And that led to the discovery, or one of the things that led to the discovery. So I think that's something that can't be discounted in the scientific method is the idea of thought experiments. When actual experiments, it's impossible maybe to design an experiment to ride on a light wave, but it's entirely possible to imagine it. One thing
Yeah.
I wanted to ask too is about the definition of virtue. Plato never gives a definition of virtue. And this is something I guess too that people need to think about as they're talking about these things. You know, we could say this person's not virtuous or this person is virtuous, but who's really to determine what virtue is? And I think we've seen in a number of Plato's dialogues where he questions one particular thing that's held out to be a virtue, usually is courage. People will say courage is a virtue, but is courage always a virtue? And I think he provides a number of examples where courage is not necessarily virtuous. So that's an example of where discussion, I think, needs to occur, right?
Well, that's kind of a hallmark of the virtue ethics tradition and what distinguishes it from someone like Immanuel Kant, that virtue is contextual. So there's a sense in which you can give a definition to a virtue, but the definition is not going to tell you what the manifestation of that virtue will look like in a particular context. The definition is a learning tool for somebody who's becoming virtuous to sort of get a sense of the virtue. But for Plato, ultimately, everything comes down to wisdom, which is something like having the discernment to perceive what is good for that particular situation. So it might be courageous to stand up to an intruder that comes into your house, but that depends on whether or not what you're doing is going to produce the good of the situation. So, there's been lots of studies how sometimes it's better to acquiesce to somebody who's using force against you to give the wider law enforcement community time to address and ameliorate the situation because it's better for them to intervene than for you to pull out a weapon and try to intervene yourself. And so I think the real key for Plato is the more we contemplate the form of the good, the form of justice, the form of courage, the form of moderation, the form of wisdom, the more we're going to become the kinds of people, the nature that he was talking about here, who can apply those excellencies in particular situations well.
Yeah, and as you said, he doesn't ever say that one isn't capable of ascending, the divided line of knowledge I was going to mention from the Republic. One isn't stuck in life on a particular part of that line. So the divided line of knowledge starts with belief, then goes to opinion, which is supported belief, I guess, with a hypothesis. Then it moves to knowledge, and then it moves at the highest level to wisdom. And everybody's capable of doing that. He doesn't ever, he's not an elitist who ever says that, you're born into a certain, and this is one of the things about the Republic. People read it and say, well, you're born into the bronze, silver, or gold classes and you'll always be there. But that's not what he was saying in the Republic. And the whole point of, I think, his exercise in dialogue is to encourage people to proceed along that divided line of knowledge and to see those divisions and to understand that there's always something that comes after what you think you know.
One last thing I wanted to add before we move on to the remainder of our readings here. You brought up artificial intelligence a moment ago. And as you were talking, you made me sort of think that this passage where he says, for this reason, anyone who is seriously studying high matters will be the last to write about them and thus expose his thought to the envy and criticism of men. And so it gives this impression that Plato is against writing things down. And so, therefore, is Plato like anti-technology? No, obviously not. He wrote lots of things. He wasn't against writing, but he was against a certain form of writing, namely writing, again, the answer key in a way that sort of shortcuts the dialectical process. And I was thinking, for us today, artificial intelligence would actually be the parallel technological conundrum. It's not that if Plato were alive today, he would be against artificial intelligence wholesale, but I think he would have a similar kind of line if he were writing this letter today, where he would say, serious people would not put philosophical questions to an artificial intelligence because it's doing the thinking for them. And that's really the heart of it. It's not about being anti-technology today or back then. It's about what do we have a responsibility to do as knowers and doers in the world. We want to know truth and we want to act virtuously. And so, in the pursuit of those two goals, we can't offload that labor, that long and arduous labor he was talking about, to technology to know and do for us. I think that's more the heart of what he's saying here.
Yeah, well put. And I think the other thing, and I keep talking about this, is that we need as adults to teach children how to think for themselves and to learn for themselves. And the more we present the machine's outputs as knowledge, the less inclined I think the children will be to develop their own thought processes and to be able to discern between truth and falsehood. And so I think that's a very critical thing that we forget. We think about our own convenience, but we forget about the children and our responsibility to them to raise them to bring them along that divided line of knowledge and for them to discover how to get even further than we are on the divided line of knowledge. I think that's really key. And what you said about writing reminds me of, oh boy, which dialogue is it that Thamus and Thuth, was it Phaedrus?
Yeah, Phaedrus is the other one where he has
Yeah,
this discussion
the,
about
the,
writing.
the Phaedrus. Yeah. And there was one line in there where it said that writing is a recipe for forgetfulness. I always like that line. And so it's, as you said, if you put down what people say is the truth, then people follow that or think that it's the truth and they forget the other perspectives, I guess, that can be put on it. So, yeah, again, another part where the voice of Plato, I think, is clearly talking here. So, as you said, why don't we go to, and maybe if you wouldn't mind doing this, reading 334D to 335A, because we're talking about virtue, and I think this section really talks about virtue being recognizable in noble actions. So, if you wouldn't mind reading that.
Yeah, happy to, James. And just to remind listeners, this all is happening in the context of a letter that's being written from Plato to essentially the trustees of Dion's legacy, his property and his political connections and all of that. These are the people who are sort of wanting to honor his legacy. And so in this section, Plato kind of speaks a little bit to his purpose in that regard. Plato says, I have said all this for the purpose of advising Dion's friends and relatives. And to all that has been said, I add the same advice and the same doctrine that I have given twice before. Do not subject Sicily nor any other state to the despotism of men, but to the rule of laws. This is at least my doctrine. For despotic power benefits neither rulers nor subjects, but is an altogether deadly experience for themselves, their children, and their children's children. And no one grasps at the prizes it offers except petty and illiberal souls who know nothing of the divine and human goods that are now and for all time good and just. This is the doctrine that I endeavored to bring home, first to Dion, next to Dionysius, and now for the third time I do so to you. Listen to me, then, in the name of Zeus the Savior, to whom this third libation belongs. Consider Dionysius and Dion, of whom one was deaf to my teachings and now lives ignobly, and the other listened to me and died nobly. For it is altogether noble and right to suffer whatever may come while aiming at the highest for oneself or one's city. None of us can avoid death, nor if any man could, would he be happy, as people think. For there is nothing worth mentioning that is either good or bad to creatures without souls. But good and evil exist only for a soul, either joined with a body or separated from it. We must always firmly believe the sacred and ancient words declaring to us that the soul is immortal, and when it has separated from the body will go before its judges and pay the utmost penalties. Therefore we must count it a lesser evil to suffer great wrongs and injustices than to do them. Though this is a saying that the avaricious man who is poor in the goods of the soul will not give ear to, or if he does, laughs it into silence, as he thinks, and goes about like a wild beast, snatching from every quarter whatever he thinks will furnish him meat or drink or the satisfaction of that slavish and graceless pleasure incorrectly called after Aphrodite. He is blind and does not see what defilement his plunderings involve, nor how great an evil attaches to each wicked act, a defilement which the evildoer necessarily drags with him as he goes up and down the earth and follows his dishonorable and utterly wretched path to the world below. Now, Dion has had accepted this and other similar teachings of mine, and I may rightly be as indignant at his murderers as at Dionysius. Both parties have done infinite wrong to me, and I may say to all mankind. The first two in striking down a man whose purpose was to realize justice, the other in refusing to have anything to do with justice, though he possessed every resource for making it prevail throughout his domain. If in his empire there had been brought about a real union of philosophy and power, it would have been an illustrious example to both Greeks and barbarians, and all mankind would have been convinced of the truth that no city nor individual can be happy except by living in company with wisdom under the guidance of justice, either from personal achievement of these virtues or from a right training and education received under God-fearing rulers.
Wow, that's a powerful passage. A number of really powerful statements in there. They're talking about slavish and graceless pleasure. And I think again to bring Plato into the 21st century, that last paragraph that you read there, I think was particularly resonant about Dionysius was the ruler who had all of the tools at hand to pursue justice, and he chose not to. And I think there are rulers in the world today similarly equipped who could pursue justice, but they seem to be bound to some sort of slavish and graceless pleasures and not really thinking that far ahead. So it really reminded me of that theme that we were talking about in terms of bringing Plato into the 21st century. And again, the idea of dying nobly rather than to commit injustice. One should suffer injustice rather than commit it. And again, that was the story of Socrates. Really powerful section.
Yeah, I'm particularly struck by just the wonderful summation that he gives to his much more involved discussions in both the Republic, the Statesman, and the Laws. This is again one of those passages that I think really show that this is Plato, the author, writing this. I just wanted to especially draw attention to two aspects here. First, where he says, despotic power benefits neither rulers nor subjects. That I think is just one of his enduring insights that, his response to Glaucon's thought experiment in the Republic is Glaucon says, why shouldn't we try to be a despot? Sure, despotism is terrible for their subjects, but it's great for the despot. And Plato wants to say, no, it isn't. To be a despot is an awful life, and to be under a despot is an awful life. So there's no good reason to pursue this. And then the other thing that really stuck out about this, and this I've actually borrowed this line from Plato whenever I'm teaching the Republic, is where he says, if in a leader's empire there has been brought a real union of philosophy and power. I sometimes write it as the coincidence between philosophy and power, which is the real meaning of the so-called philosopher kings, which I prefer to call philosopher servants because that's really what Plato means by it. And he's not talking about let's go find the philosophers and they become this hereditary ruling caste or something like that. That's not what he's talking about. He's saying, and I think he puts it so well here, that you need a wise society governed under the guidance of justice before you will have justice. There's no shortcut here for getting justice in your society. So if you're not focused on making sure that those who have power are intersecting with philosophy in some way, whether by being philosophers themselves or advised by true philosophers, then you're kind of in this hopeless chasing your tail exercise of trying to find justice without being willing to undertake the process that would actually achieve justice. And that really is the thesis of the Republic, I would argue.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. And what you said about the tyrant not really being happy with his existence, I think is clear. And in the context of Dionysius, that little part that I read, he failed to become a friend to himself. That was his downfall. That was really perhaps the real source of his downfall, is that he didn't accept that friendship of self. And this maybe touches on another really contentious part of Plato, which is that Plato says that the soul is immortal. And we have these souls in us that once the body dies, the soul goes on. And I think that's pretty contentious, but I don't know. To me, I think it's empowering. The idea that one's learning just simply doesn't end when the body dies. It's transmitted through the soul. This thing that you cannot see, but we all know that we have some power or force inside us that makes us different people and makes us hope and love and hate and all of these things. It's some people might say that these are chemical reactions, but I think that's I don't know, it's a awfully dim view of life, maybe, that we're just these bags of chemistry walking around and reacting to chemical signals. I think that there is some force in us. Call it a soul or whatever you want, a spirit or something. There is some force in us that has permanence, that belongs to that realm of being, that eternal realm of being that's not part of the body, is the part of the realm of becoming, that constantly changing realm, but the soul is in the realm of being, and that's the permanent realm. That's where you want to be.
I think there's a real practical implication too for this analysis of the soul that he brings in here. You know, he has this little excursus on the avaricious man, the person who goes around just satisfying every desire. And what he's trying to drive at, and this actually connects to your earlier discussion about the focus on the empirical and how the sciences often think only the empirical is the real. What he's saying is that the life of a good soul produces a treasure, an eternal treasure, that is of greater value than the satisfactions of our bodily pleasures. And so that kind of hierarchy of goods, I think, is if anybody has ever found themselves thinking in those terms, they were unwittingly drawing from Plato's legacy. And these treasures of the soul, being a just person, being a wise person, which he thinks is the highest good, there's no empirical way to measure that. There's no commodification to that. It's not something you can sell at the supermarket. And so, yes, all of this is tied together that if you can't see the intelligible realm, the being of things, and you can only see the appearances of things, then you're going to miss the things that are most worth living for. As a result, you're going to end up with a bad soul that from the point of view of eternity is going to be a life not worth living, even though in the heat of the moment, it may seem like it's the best idea you've ever had to get smashed drunk and puke your guts out.
Which is fun sometimes, but one grows out of that as one gets older, as I know. Yeah, I mean, the unexamined life is not worth living. I mean, that's a good quote from Socrates. And one needs to be able to examine not just the physical body, but what's inside the physical body. And I think maybe to go back to the reading that I started with, where Plato said that one cannot commit the most precious thing that one has, the thinking or the combination of thoughts in the soul, one cannot commit those to writing. It's too precious to commit to writing. It's something that really needs to connect with other souls. It's not just something that can be rendered on a piece of paper and left for physical evidence. That's really, I think, the power of the soul that he's talking about, and why he didn't put his thoughts in writing, because that's his most precious possession. If we have, you call it a soul or a spirit or whatever, my soul is my most precious thing. It's something that nobody else has. Only I have it. Whereas, these material goods that the tyrants might think they're taking pleasure in, they're here and they're gone. They have no permanence. But the soul is something that has permanence. And I think those who don't think that the soul is permanent, that the soul just simply disappears when the body dies, where it comes from, who knows? But I'm not sure that that's going to really lead one to examine one's life if you don't think that you have something permanent in you.
Shall I read our last couple little sections here?
Yeah, let's proceed.
So we have a short reading from 337D to 337E. If the victors show themselves more eager than the vanquished to obey the laws, then everything will be safe, happiness will abound, and all these evils will take their flight. But let no one who refuses to abide by these principles call upon me or anyone else for support. These proposals are akin to those that Dion and I tried to accomplish for the benefit of Syracuse, but second best. The best were those that we earlier tried to effect with the aid of Dionysius himself, that is, the goods that are common to all. But fortune is mightier than men and shattered our plans. Now it is for you to try to bring them about with better luck, and may divine favor attend your efforts. This is probably my favorite part of the whole letter. There's two things that I think really stand out about it. The first is that this is part of a longer passage where Plato is making clear that the purpose of victory in a conflict is to promote the good of everyone, not the victors. And I just think that is a revolutionary concept that political societies are still struggling to learn today. That if my political party gets into power, that doesn't mean we get to ram our agenda down everybody's throat and do what we want. The heck with everyone else. No, the purpose of whoever prevails in any kind of contest for political power is to then serve the common good of everyone, not what's in the interests of those in power. And so Plato says, if you don't practice that when you attain power, you will not find support from me. And then he says he was trying to enact this type of vision in his work in Syracuse. The second best is when Dion and him were trying to overthrow the tyranny. He said the best would have been to get the tyrant themselves to convert to philosophy. Neither of those worked out. Why? He says, fortune is mightier than men and shattered our plans. So, this is the realism of Plato, that he's not talking about pie in the sky, whatever. He's realistic that most political outcomes are due to fortune and not the best laid plans of mice and men. He could have written in the next line, therefore I despair and I'm going off to drink hemlock and die to go be with Socrates. But no, he doesn't despair. He acknowledges his failure. He's honest about it. And then he says, now it is for you to try to bring them about with better luck, and may divine favor attend your efforts. And I read that line as not just for Dion's friends and followers. I think that line is for all of us down through the ages, that however much humans are still struggling to achieve justice, now it is for us to try to bring about justice with better luck, and may divine favor attend our efforts.
Yeah, that's so powerful. And, we see rulers now who abide by the winner take all principle. And here he's saying that that's doing themselves no favor either. I think here he's talking too about the importance of society. It's not just one powerful person like a Thrasymachus from the Republic who we talked about last time. It's not just what one person says, it's what the whole society says. As you pointed out, that one person, Plato, I mean, if he is like the prisoner in the cave who escaped the cave, saw the light, and was coming back into the cave to show the cave dwellers path to truth, he may have succeeded with Dion, but he didn't succeed with Dionysius. But that certainly wasn't for lack of trying. It was an honest effort, more than an honest effort. He went back the third time and he nearly didn't escape. I mean, he was held prisoner because the tyrant never keeps his word. And that was the case 2,400 years ago as it is now. So one person, as brilliant as Plato may have been, one person can't do it all by himself. You need the entire fabric of society to work together, which is, as you say, why this section is so powerful. It says that the victor can't act just for their own good. It has to be the good for everybody, of everybody, so that the society will grow. And maybe in not practicing this, we will experience a lack of growth now. And maybe this is a lesson for this time that the power really needs to be tempered by justice. Let me maybe go on and I'll read. I think this is our last reading for today, this part from 340b to 341a. And this is where he talks about his arrival in Syracuse. Plato writes, when I arrived, I thought my first task was to prove whether Dionysius was really on fire with philosophy, or whether the many reports that came to Athens were without foundation. Now, there is a certain way of putting this to the test, a dignified way and quite appropriate to tyrants, especially to those whose heads are full of half understood doctrines, which I saw at once upon my arrival was particularly the case with Dionysius. You must picture to such men the extent of the undertaking, describing what sort of inquiry it is, with how many difficulties it is beset, and how much labor it involves. For anyone who hears this, who is a true lover of wisdom, with the divine quality that makes him akin to it and worthy of pursuing it, thinks that he has heard of a marvelous quest that he must at once enter upon with all earnestness, or life is not worth living. And from that time forth he pushes himself and urges on his leader without ceasing until he has reached the end of the journey or has become capable of doing without a guide and finding the way himself. This is the state of mind in which such a man lives. Whatever his occupation may be, above everything and always he holds fast to philosophy and to daily discipline that best makes him apt at learning and remembering, and capable of reasoning soberly with himself, while for the opposite way of living he has a persistent hatred. Those who are really not philosophers, but have only a coating of opinions, like men whose bodies are tanned by the sun, when they see how much learning is required and how great the labor, and how orderly their daily lives must be to suit the subject they are pursuing, conclude that the task is too difficult for their powers, and rightly so, for they are not equipped for this pursuit. But some of them persuade themselves that they have already sufficiently heard the whole of it, and need make no further effort. Now, this is a clear and infallible test to apply to those who love ease and are incapable of strenuous labor, for none of them can ever blame his teacher, but only himself, if he is unable to put forth the efforts that the task demands. So, kind of winding up with that thought of having to put in the work to reach that understanding. And I guess he's saying Dionysius just simply wasn't willing to put in the work. I guess a tyrant doesn't think that he has to do anything. People are there to do things for him.
Yeah, I suspect that's definitely part of it. I also think, even though I didn't catch him using the word here, but we should read this passage as another one of Plato's many commentaries on love, where when he says, You must picture to such men the extent of the undertaking, describing what sort of inquiry it is, with how many difficulties it is beset, and how much labor it involves. For anyone who hears this, oh, there it is, who is a true lover of wisdom, with the divine quality that makes him akin to it and worthy of pursuing it, thinks that he has heard a marvelous quest that he must at once enter upon with all earnestness, or life is not worth living. We could make an analogy to some of Jesus's parables about the kingdom of heaven is like a pearl of great price. A man went and sold all he had and bought it. Or the kingdom of heaven is like a treasure in a field. When a farmer discovered it, he went and sold all he had and bought the field. There's a similar kind of sentiment here that for both, I think, Jesus and Plato, there's this sense that there are certain things of eternal and inestimable value that when you fall in love with those things, no amount of effort could ever be a barrier to you pursuing those things. And so, really, the rest of this section is a test where he's saying, I was testing Dionysius to see was he willing to put in the effort, because that would be evidence that he is truly a lover of wisdom. And those who do not want to put in the work therefore show that they're not in love with this and that they don't actually think these eternal objects are worth pursuing.
Yeah, and you made the excellent point in our last discussion about Plato's philosophy of loving your neighbor. As something that really comes through in all of the dialogues, that you have respect for your neighbor. And that's something the soul or the spirit in us does. Love doesn't necessarily bring power. It doesn't necessarily bring money. In fact, you could lose power and you could lose money from it, but it's something that we pursue for some reason because love is that divine. He uses the word divine in that section, and that's maybe something that's divine, something that really is beyond any quantifiable value. And as you say, Dionysius just did not show that love of wisdom. Maybe for this tyrannical mind, wisdom was something to be acquired, something to be bought, whereas it's something to be found inside, I think is what he's saying with this passage.
Yeah, if I can make just one last analogy here to the comparable teachings of Jesus. There are other stories and stuff in the stories about Jesus where he'll say things like, there's this story of a rich young man who comes to him and says, I've kept the whole law. What else do I need to do to enter the kingdom of heaven? And Jesus says, well, you have to give away all of your wealth to the poor and come follow me. And he goes away sad because he has a lot of money and doesn't want to give it away. And the point of that story, I think, in part is the life worth living is worth living, but it's not easy because we're so wrapped up in the temptations of this world that we don't realize the amount of sacrifice that's going to be required. Again, sacrifice worth making, but we're going to pretty fundamentally have to rearrange the way we live our lives. And I think something very similar is going on here. This is a clear and infallible test to apply to those who love ease and are incapable of strenuous labor. In other words, I think what Plato is saying is a lot of people don't want to give up the comforts, the status, the power, the fame, the convenience of their lives. And when we think about us in the world today and about the kinds of personal sacrifices that would be required if we really wanted to abolish global poverty, if we really wanted to address the degradation of our climate, if we really wanted to end human trafficking once and for all, most people respond like that rich young man, or respond like Dionysius does here, that yeah, they want to make those changes, but not with all of those sacrifices involved. And so my last thought here would be If someone comes to me as a philosopher and says, I want to live a life worth living, help me, I will do all that I can to show them the way. But if they come to me and say, I want to live the life worth living, but I don't want to have to work for it, then like Plato, there's nothing that I can do for you.
Yeah, there's no checklist. Here's the checklist for the life worth living. If you complete these 10 tasks, then you've achieved it. But as you know, as you said, soul searching, which is a term that we use, even people who don't believe in souls, is a term that we use, and it's a difficult thing. And I think as one gets older, one does a lot more soul searching, or is maybe more inclined to. A lot of people don't, but is more inclined to, and that's really where the power of reflection and recollection comes about. And recollection is something that Plato said, I think it was in the Sophist, is what the soul does without the physical things. It's when you close your eyes, turn off the senses, and you recall all of those things. And I think that's the hard part. One really needs to separate themselves from everything, all of these material things around, which, give us, um, allow us to survive, allow us to live in comfort. I mean, I want to live with walls and a roof. I don't want to live out in the cold. So that's a certain amount of physical items that I need to survive. But, does one really need everything? And that's where the soul searching comes about. What other things could you do with your life? And the unexamined life is not worth living. I agree entirely with Socrates on that. So, in winding up our discussion on Plato's seventh letter, I'm just wondering, what your general impression is if you were to put it in one or two sentences. Somebody reading this letter for the first time, is there a lesson for the 21st century in this, written 2,400 years ago?
Yeah, there's two broad takeaways I have from the letter. The first is this letter makes very clear that for Plato, to be theoretical is to be practical. And if you're not willing to put in the theory, that is to do the hard metaphysical work to understand the real essences of things, then you're not being practical. So I think it's a real strong rebuff of a lot of contemporary attitudes that being practical is to dispense with the theoretical, with metaphysics, with the being of things. Yeah, we don't need all that speculative, airy-fairy stuff. No, I think he's making very clear that you're only being practical if you care about the being of things. The other takeaway I have is the time gap between us and this letter. It's been 2,400 years since Plato attempted to undertake a philosophical revolution in Sicily. And since then, there have been other people who, in earnest, have undertaken efforts to produce philosophical revolutions. We're still pretty far from justice. We've made some gains. I think that the time gap really shows us the level of difficulty that Plato is talking about. This is not something that we humans are going to naturally evolve into. This is not something that's going to come voluntarily. That is, if we just go around and tell people, come on, just do the right thing, nothing is going to come easy. It didn't come easy in Plato's day. It didn't come easy for his students. We know that Aristotle tried to undertake a similar philosophical revolution with Alexander the Great, and that sort of ended up backfiring for him. Um, we know that have been philosophers who have acceded to power, Marcus Aurelius being the most famous, and he, tried to undertake reforms for the Roman Empire, but in most cases they didn't stick. And we all know that the Roman Empire really fell apart in the centuries after him and down through the ages to today. And this will be my last comment. If you ever wanted a proof that we will not have justice until we have the coincidence of philosophy and power, it's the fact that here we are 2,400 years later, still struggling for justice. and still unwilling to make that hard shift where we demand wisdom and virtue in our rulers, that only those who rule are those who don't want to rule. Until we take Plato seriously on these things, we're going to struggle another 2,400 years. And if Plato was here today, he would tell us that's not worth it. Make the change now rather than putting off to tomorrow what you can do today.
Well said, well said. And especially so when we have great technological power with which we could benefit ourselves tremendously, our collective selves, but we could also destroy ourselves. And we don't have the leisure of another 2,400 years to experiment. I think this is really, as you said, this is putting theory into practice. And I think the real lesson here is that one with a philosophical mind can go out and try to lead others to philosophy. And, as you said earlier, don't despair if you fail, because it will never always meet with always success. But one has to make the effort. And the more people that make the effort, the more collective success there'll be. And it's really, in terms of a philosophical revolution, this is not, of course, the idea of people, philosophers, going out with swords and threatening people that they need to think a certain way. The philosophical revolution is the revolution where people would examine their lives, I think. And it's really a change in mindset, perhaps. I think that what really comes forth in this letter to me is the difference in mindsets between Dion and Dionysius. And Plato here, as in other places, really brings the human condition to the forefront. And what existed back then, 2,400 years ago, still exists in the human condition. We see rulers like Dionysius, and we see people like Dion really keen to examine and to learn. And as a society, I think we need to really find that path to virtue together and to bring this into a lesson with the laws. The citizens need to be virtuous, as do the leaders. It can't just be one or the others. We can't expect virtuous leaders to arise if the citizens aren't virtuous. And I think a really key lesson of this is that virtue can't be taught. It's something that can be learned collectively. It can't be taught because we're always prone to the sophists in their teaching, but we can learn together and change mindsets, I think, as a result. And that would be a great thing. That would be a great thing. I love this letter for the message it brings to us from 2,400 years ago. It's not ancient philosophy, it's timeless philosophy.
Well said, James.
Well, Michael, it's been really great talking about Plato's seventh letter, and maybe we can talk about some of the other letters as well, bring those into the mix. I've learned a lot from this, and I want to really thank you again for introducing me to the seventh letter. And I'm hoping our listeners will give it a read and reflect on what it says about our lives in the 21st century and what we could maybe do differently, and maybe a happier approach to life.
I hope so too, James.
Well, great. I look forward to our next discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you.